第一场的专题演讲呢，我们其实也是用视讯的方式，非常难得的呢，邀请到 HolonIQ 共同执行长跟创办人 Mr. Patrick Brothers 为我们分享的是全球教育科技市场的趋势报告。那么 HolonIQ 呢，这一所机构呢，其实是一个观看国际教育市场的机构。它强调的是 data-driven research， 它主动会搜集非常多的资讯作为他们研究的基础。那其实呢，我们台湾也费尽心思哦，主动提供 HolonIQ 这样子的资讯，希望台湾在国际的关注度上面呢也可以提升。那么现在我们是不是就能够连线这个 HolonIQ 的创办人 Mr. Patrick Brothers 呢 ？OK， 那我们现在可以连线了吗 ？OK， 好。Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome HolonIQ Mr. Patrick Brothers to share the most updated insight of education market. Hello, good morning.
Hello, everybody.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Hi, everybody. How are you?
Oh, yes. Hi, good morning, Mr. Brothers. Would you like to say hello to the audience? Hi. Let's test. 大家可以挥挥手吗？ Hey, we are here. Okay, it's your time now. Let's begin the session. Thank you.
Fabulous. If I can share my presentation, please. If somebody could let me share that presentation, it would be wonderful. I just need permission to share this presentation and we'll make a start. Well, it's wonderful to be with you all. I wish I could be there in person. I really do. I think I can now share. No. Okay, perfect. Okay, hopefully you can all see those slides. Ready to make a start? Hi everybody, my name's Patrick Brothers, co-CEO of HolonIQ. It is so wonderful to be with you today. And as I said, I really wish I could be there in person with you as well. For the next 40 minutes, we're going to cover an enormous amount of data and insights. This presentation will be made available to you as well to go back and reflect on anything that is useful and helpful for you in your journey for education innovation as well. As with all good learning, I'm actually going to pause twice during this period and ask you to compare notes with somebody next to you, whether you're here virtually or whether you're there in person as well. I'm going to pause for a couple of minutes and ask you to share your insights on the way through. HolonIQ is a global organization. We are incredibly privileged to work with governments, with education institutions, with companies and with investors all around the world. Everything that you will see today connects those insights of what we're seeing everywhere, from Asia, the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Oceania, all around the world. So let's make a start. We're going to cover 5 main topics over the next 40 minutes. Firstly, we're going to look at the size and shape of global education and reflect just how significant global education is. We're going to look at the global learning landscape, a way of better understanding all of the innovation that is happening globally. We're going to look at the investment that's happening, not the government investment, but the private investment that's happening to power new innovation, partnering with education institutions around the world. We'll have a quick look at the landscape of innovation in different regions of the world and a project that we're planning for mapping the education innovation in Taiwan. And then finally, we're going to look to the future, to 5 scenarios for education in 2030. And I'm going to ask you to pick one as well. So let's make a start. The size and shape of global education. There are nearly 8 billion people in the world. It is incredible. And on the slides here, what you won't see in the detail, but you'll see in the colors, is the growth in the highest level of education attainment for all people on Earth. That 7.8 billion people today you can see in blue is showing people around the world whose highest level of education is a post-secondary education. The green is secondary schooling. The yellow is primary schooling. And the red, very sadly, is children around the world, adults around the world who did not receive a formal education at all. You can see the global population is growing to over 9 billion people and is projected to between now and 2050. And you can see the growth since 1990 when it was just over 5 billion. And on the right-hand side, you can see there'll be 1 billion more people with a post-secondary qualification. There'll be 1.2 billion more people through secondary school. What this makes us reflect on is how will we be ready? How will we ensure that the education we deliver today is not just better, but we can deliver it more broadly? One of the most interesting trends here is the growth in participation in education comes from better education systems, governments leading better policy around the world, but also girls. Girls joining formal education has played a significant part in more people around the world being formally educated. At the very start of COVID, we asked our executive panel, which is several thousand ministers, CEOs, vice chancellors, presidents, leaders in education institutions, what their expectations were for disruption. And what the left-hand chart shows us is perhaps no surprise. There was a very large change in attitude and a disruption beyond COVID. Disruption to our education systems was very, very anticipated. On the right-hand side, we saw organisation institutions, both public and private, around the world, switching to their primary strategy, their primary focus, being about new technologies, being about new products. And as you all know, this is very, very different to how this result would have been seen only 6 months prior, let alone a couple of years prior as well. Before COVID, one of the things we do is we try and size how much investment is going into education. Investment from governments, investment from companies doing corporate training, investment from parents, and investment by ourselves as learners to upskill ourselves. In 2018, that was a total of $6 trillion invested by governments, by individuals, and by companies around the world. And before COVID, we expected that to grow in 2025 to nearly $8 trillion. You can see, again, pre-COVID, our biggest expectation in terms of change was actually in pre-K. Specifically in Asia, compared to the rest of the world, there is a very heavy focus on those early childhood years, about those years not being about child care, but about learning. You'll also see a big change in our expectations for how companies participated in global education. We saw a less share from formal institutions and a growing share on employers participating and paying for learning for their employees. Post-COVID, we're in a really different environment and everyone is still uncertain about what that means. But we tried our best a few months ago to quantify the impact of COVID on those projections on the global education market. This is the spend by governments, the spend by companies, the spend by individuals. We saw in 2025 that spend dropping by $500 billion, not because there was less of a focus or less education, but because it was cheaper and it was becoming more affordable over that period. Some of the drivers, you saw those population drivers. There will be many, many more learners around the world. It's growing very strong day by day. But we saw higher education, specifically in the North American market, where it is incredibly expensive and there is a significant student loan issue. We saw what we call the deflation of those prices over time. We saw faster, cheaper, and credible alternatives for students to achieve those credentials that employers would recognize and hence employ people, not always looking for a degree, which for a long time now has been considered where we should send our children. And then finally, digitization. Education is in a very, very early stage of digitization. The only sector which is less digitized than education is the construction industry. We see digitization driving a much lower cost base of all of these institutions around the world. Meanwhile, education technology is exploding. We've estimated in 2019 about $163 billion was spent globally on technology in education. That only represents 2.7% of the total spend. So less than 3% of the total spend on education was spent on technology. We see that changing really significantly, and post-COVID, representing more than $400 billion of investment globally by 2025. Some consider that a very, very aggressive outlook, but it would still only represent 5% of the total spend on education technology. And so there are others that consider it incredibly conservative. Innovation is happening across the entire learner life cycle around the world. We're seeing innovation in early childhood. We're seeing innovation on that pathway into K-12. K-12 is actually changing quite significantly. And I'm not just talking about the impact of COVID. The pathway into higher education, into vocational education, into all forms of post-secondary and tertiary education is changing. And one of the biggest changes we're seeing in many, many parts of the world is the changes on how training and learning and development is happening inside the workforce, into the workforce and after the workforce as well. Switching a little bit to advanced technology, where we're seeing very exciting but early developments in what might help education innovate. You can see on the left-hand side the growth in augmented reality and virtual reality. COVID has very much accelerated the experimentation with new immersive technologies. Artificial intelligence, which we've mapped quite significantly all around the world. It's really exciting, the potential, but it's still early days. It's still early days. And somewhat, COVID has meant going back to basics. That development in artificial intelligence, I'll share an example very shortly, is still happening, but it's still very early days. Robotics in the STEAM area is big and it is growing. Children are finding new ways of engaging with STEM. And blockchain as well, again, even earlier and even more experimental. But there's much promise and much investigation by governments and companies alike around the world on how blockchain might support innovation in education. I'm hoping this shows up well through video. And what I'm showing you is a German company that is using visual-based artificial intelligence to help train and to help interview people, looking at and using vision-based artificial intelligence to conduct assessments and to give people feedback on their soft skills, not just on hard skills using artificial intelligence in mathematical areas, but using artificial intelligence in soft skills areas as well. This is both exciting and very scary. It's uncharted territory. As we all know, there are significant concerns about ethics and the like, but the technology is evolving very rapidly. We must get ahead and better understand both its potential and the safeguards that we need to put in place. Globally, nations around the world, governments around the world are slowly developing national AI strategies. We have stock-taked about 50 of those strategies, including Taiwan's AI action plan. It's what's very interesting digging into these AI strategies is how fundamental the education system is to a nation's AI strategy, which for many is considered a very important competitive pillar of countries over the next decades to come. It's really the education system that many are turning to as what will be the core competitive advantage of nations over the coming decades. I want to pause there and I want to try something a little bit interactive. I want to pause for 2 minutes, and I can see everybody there in the audience in Taiwan. And for those of you on live stream, I want you to move to somebody close to you, COVID safe, of course, and share what is it that you just learned or you just saw that struck you, that you thought was either new information or surprising information, or something that you're concerned about and you want to investigate a little bit further. I'm going to pause for 2 minutes and allow you to find somebody and compare notes really quickly on the one thing that surprised you. Over to you. I'm very fortunate to have a camera. I can see the crowd in Taiwan. Please share some insights with the person next to you, and then I'll make a start and we'll keep moving. I'll give you one more minute. All right, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We only have 40 minutes. I have so much to share with you. So let me make a start. I hope there was something that did strike you in that first session. Now let's look at the global learning landscape. Let's make a better understanding of all of this innovation and create, if you like, some way of organizing all of that. We have been doing a project for many, many years now where we use machine learning to find patterns in all of the organizations, startups, institutions alike, public and private, all around the world. We thought we would use a modern technique to catalog innovation rather than trying to look at innovation by pre-K, K-12, higher education and workforce. We used machine learning to do that from a bottom-up perspective. We then engaged human experts around the world to make sense of that. Machines are excellent at detecting patterns. They're not so great at interpreting them and being able to understand what they mean. What that developed for us was what we call the global learning landscape, which is an open source taxonomy for innovation in education. It's available at globallearninglandscape.org. And let me very, very quickly take you through it. It's organized from left to right across, if you like, a value chain of education. On the left-hand side, knowledge and content, curriculum, education resources, Q&A sites where students through a peer-to-peer model share insight. The management of education in red there. LMSs, student management systems, classroom technology, admissions technology. In the pink, purple, traditional models, new models of pre-K, schools, micro schools, vocational models, alternative models trying to reimagine traditional and formal education. The same with universities. Through to, in the dark orange there, new delivery models, MOOCs, proprietary online platforms, online program managers, boot camps, and there are several 100,000 education apps on the Google and the Apple app stores. Then into experiential learning, XR, AR, VR, robotics, artificial intelligence, games and simulation, STEAM and coding, through to international education in yellow, from language learning and language testing to international schools and new forms of international study. Learning support, supporting teachers, study notes, after school, tutoring and test preparation, into assessment and verification, portfolios, credentialing, career planning, new ways of verifying skills, into workforce in blue. Workforce planning, talent acquisition, capability development, performance management, wellness, which is so critical, especially in this time. And then on to skills and jobs, upskilling, internships, apprenticeships, gigs, and mentoring. We've also developed, very recently actually, a higher education digital capability framework. And we've done this with hundreds of universities and higher education professionals around the world. Again, this is an open source framework at digitalcapability.org. And from left to right, we look at demand and discovery. Where should we build these programs? How should we build these programs? How do we attract students to these programs? Into learning design, the curriculum, the content, subject matter expertise, different teaching strategies. Into green, the learner experience itself, academic administration, learning and the academic experience, student life more broadly, and assessment and verification. And then finally, onto a part that we need to do a lot better everywhere in the world is that transition into work and lifelong learning, career planning, industry and business engagement, alumni and continuing education as well. We're using this now to engage and help institutions self-assess against this framework. The biggest need that we're finding in higher education institutions around the world is a common language that the management team, the leadership team of an institution know they need to do something, but there isn't a common language in order to help prioritize and help work out where to build capability and to focus as well. So let's move on to investment and funding flows. This is tracking all of the investment that's happening around the world, specifically venture capital investment into innovation that's happening around the world as well. This year alone, including Q3, there have been $8.2 billion invested in education technology. And most of that, 5.6 billion of that, has happened in Asia, for the most part China, but India not far behind. Health technology, by comparison, healthcare and education are often compared, invested $18 billion of venture capital in innovation this year. But what's interesting on the right-hand chart is you can see them compared with one another, is Asia is a much larger investor in innovation in education than the rest of the world, by far. Compared to health tech, which education again is often compared to, where North America is actually leading investment globally in innovation. The size of the global education economy, or the global economy, not just education, everything, is $85 trillion. And you can see here the comparison of the healthcare market with the education market as well. What healthcare has done has worked out how to access private capital more and to invest that into education. Governments around the world are finding it difficult to find the same level of funding that education has been used to invest in. And this is a period of time where many are asking for more investment. You can see the growth here of this innovation venture capital since 2010 globally. The US is in blue. You can see the US led globally that investment in innovation up to about 2015, when China actually very aggressively started to invest in education innovation. You can see that investment continued. 2018 was an enormous year for Asia, specifically Chinese-based investment in education innovation, with a short drop in 2019, and that right-hand bar, which is the largest already, only includes the first, second, and third quarter of 2020 and not the fourth. This chart really makes it stand out. This is what that share of funding looks like over time. In the red, you can see China. In green, you can see India, and you can see that growth compared to the US and North America market over time. And the rest of the world is in gray. You can see these markets really dominate the investment that's happening in education innovation. There is a really strong supply of funding as well. And specifically after COVID, investors around the world are much more interested and excited at investing in education, which has been forced tragically to survive more digitally and now prompts us to evolve and innovate more broadly as well. For those of you who invest in education, the venture capital industry and the finance industry, you'll be familiar with the term unicorns. A unicorn is a startup that has been valued at over $1 billion US, and these are very rare, and hence the name unicorn. There are 20 such companies in education. The top two you can see there are Byju's and Unacademy out of India. Then a long list: Zoya Bang, Yuan Fudao, VIP Kid, Hoika, many names from China that have become unicorns, and then the US. But what's most interesting is perhaps where many of you can see this chart is standing back. You can see how different those different phases of investment have been. Each bubble here is an investment happening in one of these companies. Yuan Fudao is the largest, receiving $1 billion earlier this year and $1.2 billion alone. That's one company alone that's received $2.2 billion of funding through this COVID period as well. I'm going to move right on to regional market maps as we start to wind up and make our way to the future of education, just to look at what's happening around the world. As I said, we work with governments and with companies and investors all around the world to map this innovation. From New York, you can see here our platform showing all of the companies and education institutions in the New York, Manhattan area. This is Bangalore in India. This is Paris, and you'll be pleased to know, and I'm really excited to get started on Taipei and more broadly Taiwan to map innovation that is happening where you all are at the moment. As part of this investigation, we map some of the top organizations and teams around the world. What you see here is the China EdTech 100, which we announced in Beijing before COVID happened. These organizations are, for the most part, focusing on early childhood and on K-12, with some starting to focus on workforce and higher education. This is Africa. Africa, to the surprise of many, has an enormous amount of innovation, but it's very, very different. There is more focus on supporting teachers and schools. There's still tutoring and test prep. There is some innovative ways of helping parents afford and pay for education, a STEAM and coding environment as well, and an emerging market for jobs and upskilling. The Russia and CIS EdTech 100, we were very surprised to see how big and how much innovation was happening across the CIS countries. And you can see here it's spread all around, from language learning, talent acquisition, robotics, XR, workforce and upskilling, a really, really broad array of innovation happening in those markets. The Nordic and Baltic markets, very well regarded globally for education, for how they deliver education. You can see more advanced forms of education innovation here, more immersive uses of technology, more pedagogy and learning impact-focused organizations, but still focusing on artificial intelligence, on upskilling and other parts of the education ecosystem. Southeast Asia is a booming market, growing rapidly, a very young population, a heavy focus on skills and jobs, a focus on supporting higher education institutions, again on financing education and helping those who might not be able to afford it in the outset to access education, tutoring and test prep as well. Latin America, very exciting, very vibrant, very diverse market as well, and so much innovation happening in Latin America. Again, a heavy focus on workforce, on upskilling, with all of the usual representation in those different markets as well. So we're on to the final run, and I'm going to ask you to do one more activity here, and that will be to share your preferred scenario for education in 2030. Several thousand people have conducted this exercise, and we're usually in person, and so we can take, use technology, etc., to register your interest and play it back. And I'll share a little bit about that with you as well. Firstly, education in 2030 was again another machine learning exercise that we conducted. On the left-hand side, you can see here a chart, every single one of those dots or circles is an article. It might be an academic research paper. It might be something in a newspaper. It might be written by a journalist. But it is a thoughtful piece about the future of education. We then used machine learning to cluster each of those pieces of narrative into like areas. And so what formed from that, with detailed analysis from a top-down perspective, were 5 dominant patterns around the future of education and around education in 2030. I'll briefly describe each of these scenarios, and then I'm going to ask you to, again, share with somebody next to you which one is your preferred scenario. And then I'm going to share, after you've done that, what the rest of the world have been saying. Firstly, education as usual. This is a scenario where not much changes. This was authored before COVID, but again is being discussed in the COVID arena as the education system going back to normal when life permits it. Not much changing, this being considered a period of experimentation, perhaps many people being quite critical of whether or not technology helped us with education. And so a return to what we say, education as usual. The green scenario is a scenario we call regional rising. It's where governments around the world recognize that the investment to be made is very significant, and they collaborate. We're seeing this already in Africa. We're seeing this already in Southeast Asia. We're seeing this in Latin America. In markets where it doesn't make sense to replicate the same things over and over in different parts of the world, recognizing as part of that, that employers are increasingly regional and cross-border as well. And so regional rising represents a scenario where our education systems start to work together across borders rather than compete. Global giants in yellow is a very, very different scenario. It's a scenario where our technology giants and our education institutions that are giant essentially bring a whole long fragmented tail of education institutions together to form global giants. This is the scenario we talk about of Google leading education, of Harvard maybe being a mega institution that many are offering to. It might be Tsinghua essentially absorbing many, many institutions underneath to provide education, or Oxford University in the UK, the big brands, the global giants dominating and bringing that together to be, it is considered in a scenario sometimes more efficient, to not replicate that administrative burden and to essentially provide more education to all. The next scenario in red is peer-to-peer. And it's very different again. It follows the trend we've seen in some other industries where instead of going to an institution to learn, I find another person who has those skills already. I work in a peer-to-peer market, in a peer-to-peer economy. Instead of getting a certificate from a university to say, Patrick has attended this course and has these skills, I get that accreditation from a peer who might already be an expert in that field and is recognized as an expert in that field. And essentially, instead of paying enormous amounts of money to large institutions, we have a peer-to-peer economy where we share and we swap, we still pay, but it's a network effect. It's a peer-to-peer learning market. And then finally, Robo Revolution, which is a scenario where the technology and the artificial intelligence and the robotics that has been investing in today by 2030 is very mature and is essentially driving the learning market. It's not in this scenario replacing teachers. It's participating in very high levels of augmentation around the world. It's driving a robo revolution, a significant change in the learning market. So I actually, on the next slide, I have results from all around the world, and I asked everybody 2 questions. The first question, which I'm going to ask you, is when you think of yourself, when you think of your family, which one of these 5 scenarios would you pick as your preference If the world could only be one of these 5 scenarios, which one would you pick from a personal perspective? The second question which we ask is, how likely do you think it will be that the world ends up in one of these scenarios? That's obviously a very different question because it's no longer personal. It's about your analytical and your analysis of the situation. So let me pause there, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes to share with a person near you which of these 5 scenarios, if you were forced to pick, would you prefer for 2030? Let me stop there for 1 or 2 minutes and let you share that now. Just while you're sharing that, let me remind you, education as usual. Not much changes. After COVID, it's a return to normal. That this experimentation is not considered something that should be continued. We return to education as usual. Regional rising. Governments and regions around the world collaborate. They don't go it alone. They collaborate because it's a very big investment, but because employers are increasingly regional as well. Global giants is large institutions, large companies take a very, very big role. Mega organizations with very large brand recognition and scale around the world. Peer-to-peer, very different. I seek skills from experts who are friends, colleagues, people I'm connected to. It's through them, it's through those one-on-one personal experiences that I gain my skills. And finally, an artificial intelligence and robotics fueled future for education, not replacing teachers, but playing a very significant role in augmenting and driving the learning economy globally. I'll give you another 30 seconds just to share that. Which one is your preferred? If you're by yourself, please pick one. Please reflect, pick one of these colors, pick one of these scenarios. And in 30 seconds, I'll share what the rest of the world said.
好，我们现场的来宾有没有要回应刚刚我们主讲人 speaker 他的一些要 echo 他的一些问题或者是一些想法，有吗？如果有的话，麻烦各位举个手，我们可以邀请工作人员递麦克风给您，来跟我们的主讲者互动。
All right. I'm going to make a move and share with you what several thousand people around the world in person shared as their preferred scenario. Here you can see down the left-hand side those 5 scenarios: education as usual, regional rising, global giants, peer-to-peer, and Robo Revolution. And from left to right, you can see countries around the world and how they voted in Australia, in China, in Israel, in France, Germany, Russia, the UK, and the United States. And those circles show you how many people in each of those countries preferred each of those scenarios. So if you look back, you can see a very strong preference globally for peer-to-peer, a very strong preference in all markets you can see there. A really strong preference everywhere as well for Robo Revolution.
我是blah blah blah blah， 他在帮我录，好啊。然后我们
A strong preference for regional rising as well, you can see. But you can see perhaps in France, very unhappy with the global giants scenario compared to, say, in China, where global giants was considered it might be a better solution. But interestingly, look up in blue. There was nowhere around the world, really, that there were many preferences for education as usual. I'm going to pause there. I've already spoken way too much and for way too long. I ideally wish I was with you all in person to do something much more interactive. These slides and this presentation will, of course, be made available to you. Much of this is available for free on our website. We have an incredible partnership with METAEDU in Taiwan, and I am really excited in 2021 about mapping innovation across Taiwan in education. So let me pause there. I'm very happy. I know we've got a little bit of time left to take any questions and leave you. I'm so excited for the METAEDU Summit 2020 and to be part of it as well. Thank you so much.